Not long after the RNC decided to break its contract with NBC over the recent debates, Ted Cruz goes on to continuously bash the so-called liberal media. Now, according to The Hill, Ted Cruz said that the moderators at CNBC's GOP presidential debate were nothing more than, get this, left-wing operatives trying to weaken the Republican presidential candidate. They're all left-wingers. They're all liberals. And they're trying to shut us down. They're trying to make us look weak and stupid by making us actually answer questions on our policy. Oh, dear God, no! How dare they? That's exactly what they did. Now, Ted Cruz said this while he was speaking at the Iowa GOP's Growth and Opportunity Party in Des Moines, Iowa, this weekend. And he pointed out what seemed to be a problem with the debate. Quote, "What you wouldn't have is a bunch of left-wing operatives whose object is that whoever the Republican nominee is, they want him as battered and bruised as possible so the Democrat wins in November. Pure media conspiracy." From Ted Cruz. Here we go. Now, what's the solution to this obvious problem? Well, he wants to make all the moderators conservative pundits. I'm not kidding. He called for future debates to be hosted by moderators who have voted in the Republican primary at least once in their lives. It's a rather strange criteria. Quote, "Instead, you'd have moderators that were trying to help conservatives make a decision who's going to be the best and strongest conservative to represent us and win. Who is the proven conservative, the consistent conservative?" Okay, so basically, let's get further into this ideological bubble that Jon Stewart lovingly called Bullshit Mountain. Let's go further into Bullshit Mountain. Let's see how far we can go. Because, you're really going to be successful as a national party, a national movement, if you're only exposed to the types of questions and pushback that you want to have. Seriously. Now, for example, Cruz noted that even though the debate was branded as an economic policy forum, the moderators didn't even ask one single question about Obamacare. How dare they? Quote, "How do you have a debate on the economy and never mention Obamacare? You talk to small business owners, Obamacare is the single biggest job killer in this country. And yet the moderators, apparently there are no questions to be asked about Obamacare." Well, you know why? Because that job-killing comment, that's not true. Any moderator worth their salt, worth 2 fucking cents, would say, actually, no, Ted, that's wrong. It's actually not a job killer. According to employment data, since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, as it's actually called and known as, there have been 11 million jobs that were created. Now, okay, but he's just going to call that out as a biased source, right? Well, what's my source on that information other than the Bureau of Labor Statistics? Well, this was reported in this liberal rag called Forbes. But no, obviously biased, right? Liberal bias, how dare you report facts? I'm going to take my ball and go home. It's exactly what they're doing. Now, he also says, quote, "Other things that weren't mentioned at the debate is Common Core, ISIS, Iran. But you know what? We had plenty of time to talk about fantasy football." Yeah, in the 1 minute that it took to talk about that. And look, that was a kind of a ridiculous question. I don't like football, fantasy or otherwise. Now call me un-American, which I'm sure you probably already have. But seriously, ISIS, Iran, Common Core. Now, earlier you said, hey, this was supposed to be about economics. So let's ask about economic issues. But then you bring in ISIS and Common Core. What does that have to do with economic issues? I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I thought you wanted to thing on the economy. What the hell? What planet is this guy at? Anyway, it gets better. Because now that they've identified the problem and have a solution, let's bring in more Republican moderators. So who do they think about bringing in? This is gold. They want to bring in Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and Mark Levin. Those are the moderators. That's who Ted Cruz specifically called for to moderate the next GOP debate. I can only imagine some of the questions. For example, hey, when are we going to throw Hillary in prison for Benghazi? Or how about this one? Here's another question. On a scale of 1 to Hitler, how communist is Barack Hussein Obama? Oh, could you imagine? That's definitely a question Mark Levin would want to ask. If you've ever heard Mark Levin, you would know he would ask something like that. Or how about this one? So, when you're president, how would you prepare for the rapture? That's a question for Mr. Huckabee. I could just imagine. Look, I know it sounds a bit over the top, but do you really expect Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin to actually ask real questions instead of, probably what they're going to do is basically fillet Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee? Look, somehow I'm not convinced that you're going to have a real question, a real debate. This is going to be an infomercial. Now, finally, Ted Cruz adds this. Quote, how about we stop letting left-wing liberals moderate Republican debates? How about instead of attack journalists, we actually have real journalists? Look, once again, I find the idea that Rush Limbaugh is considered somehow a real journalist absolutely laughable. Rush Limbaugh is a lot of things. A journalist, he is not. I don't exactly see his journalism credentials. He's as much of a journalist as I am. He and I are commentators. We comment on the news. That doesn't necessarily equal journalist. There's a difference. Now, on that, look, Ted, journalists aren't actually supposed to ask questions that you want to answer. Okay? You're not supposed to pre-screen your questions. And this goes for everybody, liberal or conservative, right? You're not supposed to have easy softball questions. That's not what that's not what the media is there for. And let's be honest, the media has failed in a lot of respects when it comes to asking not just Republicans, but all politicians actual hard questions on substantive issues. Let's be fair about that. There's a real discussion we can have on the efficacy of our fourth estate and it not doing what it's supposed to do. They are lapdogs of the government, of the establishment. Whether or not that establishment is liberal or conservative. You saw a lot of sucking up by the media to the Republican establishment during the Bush era. If you want to have a discussion on that and how close media is when it comes to whoever's in power, that's a valid discussion. Let's have that discussion, and I'll be the first to agree with you that there's a problem there. That journalists are a little bit too close to politicians. But see, they're not addressing that, and they're just saying, no, it's not the fact that journalists are too close to the power establishment. No, they're just too close to the liberals. They're liberal media. When we all know that corporations are actually more conservative on their economic policies and actually favor tax cuts for themselves and fewer regulations. I wonder what party stands for those. Oh, right. The Republican Party, for the most part, has no problem with giving more and more tax cuts to large multinational corporations, media corporations, and removing regulations. And also, super PACs. Super PACs have a lot to do with how much money comes into the media during election cycles. Who's a big chief architect of super PACs? Well, I know certainly that a lot of Republicans support the idea of super PACs. To be fair, Ted Cruz, I guess not the biggest supporter of super PACs. So let's be fair on that one. But anyway, some of the debate questions, back to the debate here. You are supposed to ask tough questions. Now, I admit some of the CNBC questions were ridiculous. But then there were a lot of them which were actually substantive questions. Now, some of them were so substantive that they really didn't have much of an answer for, and so they decided not to answer that. in some respects, that CNBC debate was kind of a train wreck. But as far as them being, as Ted Cruz calls them, loaded questions aimed at embarrassing candidates rather than focus on substantive issues, I disagree. I think student debt, they brought that up. Not enough, but they brought it up. That's a substantive issue. The minimum wage, kind of a substantive issue. And a very popular issue, by the way. And the idea that giving somebody control over the economy to someone who's had a history of business crashing them into the ground or going bankrupt, well, that's a substantive issue too, because that's the next person who's going to head the economy, who's going to make very, very important decisions on certain pieces of legislation that will affect the economy. That's sort of that's a question, that's a debate that you want to have. That's a conversation you want to have. Now, here's the final thing, right? So the candidates complain about not having enough time to talk about these real issues. And you've seen some of them saying, well, we didn't have enough time to talk about important issues, but we had enough time to talk about fantasy football. Well, maybe you would have had enough time to talk about all of them if you hadn't tried to get the debate down from 3 hours to 2, which you were successful at. You were successful. You ended up cutting the debate time by a third and then complained about not having enough time to talk issues. Well, what is it? What do you want? It's ridiculous, right? Look, the overall thing here that I want to get to is that the RNC and their candidates, as of right now, they're a joke. They're a punchline. They don't want real questions. They actually don't want a debate. What they want is an infomercial to sell conservative policies to a public that doesn't necessarily want them. And when they don't get what they want, like any sort of spoiled child, they simply take their ball and they go home. And that's what you have.